By the time Michael Jackson turned 50, the world thought it knew everything about him. The headlines certainly made it seem that way. For decades, cameras followed his every move, reporters analyzed his appearance, television programs debated his decisions, and tabloids built entire industries around his name. Yet despite all that attention, one belief continued to grow. The belief that there was another side of Michael Jackson. A side the public had never fully seen, a side hidden behind the gates of Neverland. Hidden behind security teams, behind lawyers, managers, assistants, and endless media coverage. Some people believed investigators had already uncovered it. Others argued there was nothing to uncover at all. But by the time Michael reached 50 years old, the fascination had become impossible to ignore, because the rumors were everywhere. Stories about secret rooms, stories about hidden collections, stories about private archives, stories about things investigators allegedly found during searches of his property. Most people never knew what was true. And that uncertainty only made the mystery stronger. The public wanted answers, real answers, not tabloid headlines, not anonymous sources, not speculation. The strange thing was that Michael Jackson had become one of the most documented people in modern history. Millions of photographs existed, thousands of interviews existed, countless hours of footage existed. Yet many people still felt they didn't know who he really was. That contradiction fascinated the world. How could someone be so famous and still remain such a mystery? Perhaps the answer began with Neverland. For years, Neverland Ranch became one of the most talked about private properties on Earth. The ranch seemed almost unreal. A private amusement park, animals, gardens, train tracks, gnome theaters, guest houses, security gates to supporters. It reflected Michael's attempt to create a world different from the one he experienced growing up. To critics, it became a symbol of unanswered questions. And over time, those questions grew louder, especially when investigators entered the property. Suddenly, public fascination exploded. People imagined hidden discoveries, secret vaults, restricted rooms, private collections. Theories spread faster than facts. Some media outlets suggested investigators were uncovering a hidden world. Others argued the public was projecting its own expectations onto the situation. Yet one thing became clear. The searches transformed Neverland into something more than a home. It became a mystery millions wanted solved. The fascination only increased when details about Michael's personal possessions began attracting attention. Former employees spoke publicly. Reporters examined court records, documentaries revisited old investigations, and people started asking unusual questions. What exactly existed inside Michael Jackson's private world? What did he collect? What did he keep hidden from public view? Why were so many people fascinated by the contents of his homes? The answers were often less dramatic than the rumors, but not always. Because investigators did discover something interesting, not scandalous, not criminal, interesting. They found evidence of a man obsessed with preserving memories, rooms filled with books, coals of artwork, photographs, personal notes, costumes, awards, videos, music recordings, connected to nearly every stage of his life. The public expected dark secrets instead. Many observers found something else, a man archiving his own history. Yet that discovery created a different mystery. Why preserve so much? Why keep so much? Why surround yourself with reminders of the past? Some believed the answer was nostalgia. Others believed it reflected loneliness. And some believed it revealed something much deeper. The more people looked into Michael's private world, the more complicated the picture became. This wasn't the image presented by tabloids, nor was it the image presented by his biggest supporters. It was something in between. A far more human story, one involving extraordinary fame, extraordinary pressure, and extraordinary isolation. By age 50, Michael Jackson had spent most of his life under public scrutiny. Few people understood what that felt like. Imagine being watched every day, for decades. Imagine knowing that almost every decision could become a headline. Imagine knowing millions of strangers were discussing your life. Every mistake, every rumor, every appearance. That reality shaped Michael's world. And nowhere was that more visible than during the final years of his life. Financial problems were making headlines. Legal battles had left lasting scars. Media attention remained relentless. Yet behind the scenes another story was unfolding. Michael Jackson was planning a comeback, a massive comeback. One that many believed could restore his career. The project was called This Is It. 50 concerts. London, hundreds of thousands of tickets, global attention. The stakes could not have been higher. For some people, the comeback represented redemption. For others it represented risk. Because behind the excitement, rumors were spreading again. Rumors about Michael's health, rumors about his finances, rumors about whether he was physically capable of completing such an enormous commitment. The public saw advertisements. The public saw ticket sales, the public headlines, but behind closed doors, very few people knew what was really happening. And according to people who worked around him during those final years, Michael's private life looked very different from the image many imagined. He was still deeply involved in music, still reviewing performances, still discussing creative ideas, still thinking about the future. Yet there were also signs of exhaustion, signs of pressure, signs that the weight of decades in the spotlight had never truly disappeared. What made this period so fascinating was the contrast. The public saw a legend preparing for one final triumph. Meanwhile, people close to him described a man carrying burdens most fans never saw. And as investigators, journalists, former employees, and documentary filmmakers continued examining Michael's life, a new question started to emerge. What if the biggest secret wasn't hidden inside Neverland? What if it wasn't hidden inside a vault? What if it wasn't hidden inside a private collection at all? What if the real secret was the enormous difference between the public image of Michael Jackson and the private reality he spent years trying to protect? That question would lead people deeper into Michael's world than ever before. And what they discovered next would become one of the most debated chapters of his entire life. The deeper people looked into Michael Jackson's life, the stranger the story seemed to become. Not because investigators uncovered some massive hidden conspiracy, but because the reality rarely matched the headlines. For years, the public had been presented with two completely different versions of Michael Jackson. One version portrayed him as a mysterious celebrity surrounded by controversy. The other portrayed him as a misunderstood genius trapped inside a life he never truly controlled. Both sides believed they understood the truth. Yet neither side seemed capable of agreeing on what that truth actually was. And that is what made Michael Jackson such a fascinating figure. The closer people got to the facts, the more complicated everything became. During the years leading up to his 50th birthday, countless stories circulated about his private world. Some focused on Neverland, others focused on his finances, others focused on his health, and some focused on the things people believed he kept hidden from public view. There were endless rumors, stories about private rooms, stories about collections nobody had seen, stories about unreleased music, stories about journals and personal notes. Some of those stories turned out to contain elements of truth, others remained impossible to verify. But together they created an image of a man living behind layers of privacy. The irony was that Michael had spent most of his life in public. Millions had watched him grow up. Millions had watched him perform. Millions had watched him become one of the most famous entertainers in history. Yet somehow, people still felt they didn't know him. Former employees occasionally added to the mystery. Some described enormous storage areas filled with personal belongings. Others recalled rooms packed with costumes, awards, artwork, books, photographs, and memorabilia collected throughout his life. These accounts fascinated the public. Not because the items themselves were shocking, but because they offered a rare glimpse into a side of Michael few people ever saw, a private side. A personal side, a side untouched by cameras. People expected to find secrets, instead they often found evidence of obsession. Not obsession with power, not obsession with fame, but obsession with preserving memories. Boxes filled with photographs, handwritten notes, old recordings to tour materials, personal keepsakes. Items connected to different chapters of his life. It was as though Michael had spent decades building an archive of his own existence. And perhaps that made sense. After all, very few people experience fame on the scale that he did. Very few people spend their entire lives being documented. Maybe preserving those memories became a way of holding on to something that fame constantly threatened to erase. Yet while some people viewed these discoveries sympathetically, others remained convinced there was more to the story. The speculation never stopped. Whenever investigators searched a property, whenever court documents surfaced, whenever a former employee gave an interview, the same cycle repeated. Headlines appeared, rumors spread, public fascination intensified. Then reality struggled to catch up. One of the most persistent areas of speculation involved Michael's private routines. People wanted to know how he lived when cameras weren't around. What did he do? Who did he trust? How did he spend his time? The answers were often surprisingly ordinary. Reading, watching movies, listening to music, reviewing creative ideas, spending time with his children, planning future projects. Yet there was another detail that repeatedly appeared in accounts from people close to him: light. Or more accurately, the lack of it. For years reports suggested Michael struggled with insomnia. According to various accounts, sleep became one of the most difficult challenges in his life. As pressure increased, the problem allegedly worsened. And by the late 2000s, concerns about his health had become impossible to ignore. This created another contrast. Publicly, Michael Jackson remained larger than life. Privately, he appeared increasingly exhausted. Publicly, he was preparing for one of the biggest comebacks in music history. Privately, people close to him reportedly worried about the pressure he was carrying. The gap between those two realities fascinated investigators and journalists alike. Because it challenged the image people thought they knew. And perhaps nowhere was that contradiction more visible than during preparations for This Is It. The comeback was enormous. 50 shows, London. Millions of dollars. Global media attention. Failure was not an option. Every rehearsal mattered. Every decision mattered. Every performance detail mattered. People who attended rehearsals often described moments that surprised them. Some said Michael looked focused. Some said he looked energized. Others described flashes of the perfectionism that had defined his career for decades. Video footage showed him directing performers, adjusting choreography, working through stage effects, discussing creative decisions. At times, it looked like the Michael Jackson audiences remembered the performer, the perfectionist, the superstar. But even as those images circulated, another story continued unfolding behind the scenes. Questions about his health, questions about his finances, questions about the pressure surrounding the comeback, and questions about whether Michael himself fully understood what was at stake. The public only saw fragments, the media only saw fragments, even many people working around him only saw fragments. No one seemed to possess the complete picture. And that uncertainty fueled even more fascination. Because people are naturally drawn to mysteries. Especially mysteries involving famous individuals. Especially when those individuals appear to be living two completely different lives at the same time, one public, one private, one visible, one hidden. By age 50, Michael Jackson had become surrounded by layers of myth. Some were created by the media, some were created by fans, some were created by critics, and some were created by Michael himself. Yet as journalists, investigators, former employees, and documentary filmmakers continued examining those final years, one realization kept emerging. The biggest mystery wasn't what people discovered, it was what they never fully understood. Because behind the headlines, behind the rumors, behind Neverland, behind the investigations, there was still a man trying to navigate a life unlike any other. And the final chapter of that life was approaching far faster than anyone realized. What happened next would transform public interest into something much bigger. Because the events that followed would force the world to re-examine everything it thought it knew about Michael Jackson. And once that happened, the fascination surrounding his secret life would become stronger than ever. Part 3. By early 2009, Michael Jackson stood at a crossroads. The world saw opportunity. A comeback, a second act, a chance to remind millions why he had once dominated popular culture like no one before him. But behind the scenes another story was unfolding. A quieter story, a more complicated story. And in many ways, that story would become the real secret people spent years trying to understand. Because when investigators, journalists, biographers, former employees, friends and even fans began piecing together Michael's final years, they discovered something unexpected. The mystery was never hidden inside a vault. It was never hidden inside a locked room. And it was never hidden inside a secret collection. The mystery was Michael himself. For decades the public had searched for a single explanation, a single answer, a single version of Michael Jackson that made sense. But the deeper people looked, the harder that became. Some saw a musical genius. Others saw a deeply troubled celebrity. Some saw a victim of fame. Others saw a man whose decisions fueled endless controversy. The truth seemed to exist somewhere between all of those versions. And that is what made understanding him so difficult. Even the stories that generated enormous media attention often revealed very little. Take the rumors that followed him for years. Stories about hidden rooms, stories about private collections, stories about secret recordings, stories about unreleased music worth millions, stories about personal journals that supposedly explained everything. Many of these claims spread rapidly. Some were exaggerated. Some were impossible to verify. Yet they captured public attention because people desperately wanted access to the real Michael Jackson. The man behind the headlines, the man behind the image, the man behind the legend. And perhaps nowhere was that desire stronger than after his death. Suddenly every detail mattered. Every photograph, every interview, every document, every story. People revisited old footage searching for clues. Fans analyzed rehearsals. Journalists reviewed timelines. Former employees gave interviews. Documentary filmmakers revisited old controversies. Everyone seemed to be searching for something, an answer, an explanation, closure. But the more information emerged, the more complicated the picture became. Because many of the things people expected to find simply weren't there. No single revelation explained everything. No hidden document changed history overnight. No secret room contained the answers people had imagined for years. Instead, investigators and journalists often encountered something far more human. Evidence of a man trying to manage extraordinary pressure. Evidence of a man obsessed with creativity. Evidence of a man attempting to preserve memories from different periods of his life. And evidence of someone who had spent decades living inside a level of fame few people could comprehend. That realization changed the conversation. Gradually, slowly, people began asking different questions. Not what was Michael hiding, but what was Michael protecting? The distinction mattered. Because protection and secrecy are not always the same thing. Someone living a normal life can enjoy privacy without attracting attention. Michael Jackson never had that luxury. Every attempt at privacy became a headline. Every effort to escape public scrutiny became another story. The more he withdrew, the more fascinated people became. The more fascinated people became, the more they searched. And the more they searched, the more myths emerged. It became a cycle, one that followed him for most of his life. Even today, years after his death, that cycle continues. New documentaries appear. New interviews emerge. Old rumors resurface. Online debates continue, and every generation seems to rediscover the mystery for itself. Why? Because Michael Jackson's story contains something people find irresistible. Contradiction. He was one of the most visible people on earth, yet one of the most private, one of the most celebrated, yet one of the most scrutinized, one of the most successful, yet often one of the most misunderstood. Those contradictions continue to fascinate people because they resist simple explanations. And simple explanations are what people often want. Especially when discussing someone whose life felt larger than reality. Perhaps that is why so many rumors survived for so long. Not because they were proven, not because they were verified, but because they filled gaps in a story people desperately wanted to understand. When answers were unavailable, speculation rushed in. When facts were incomplete, theories multiplied. And when mysteries remained unresolved, public fascination grew even stronger. Looking back, the so-called secret life of Michael Jackson was not exposed through a single discovery. It emerged through thousands of small pieces. Court records, interviews, photographs, personal collections, rehearsal footage, accounts from people who knew him. Fragments across decades. Together, those fragments revealed a portrait far more complicated than either his strongest supporters or harshest critics often admit. A man capable of extraordinary creativity, a man carrying extraordinary pressure, a man who spent most of his life being observed, and a man who never fully escaped the consequences of that attention. In the end, perhaps the biggest secret wasn't hidden at all. Perhaps it was simply overlooked. Because while the world searched for shocking revelations, hidden rooms, and sensational answers, the reality may have been much simpler. Michael Jackson spent much of his life searching for something millions of ordinary people take for granted. Privacy, understanding, and peace. Yet those were the very things fame made hardest to obtain. That is what makes his story so enduring. Not the rumors, not the speculation, not the headlines, but the fact that decades later, people are still trying to separate the myth from the man. Still trying to understand where the legend ends and the person begins. And perhaps that question can never be answered completely. Because Michael Jackson was more than a celebrity, more than a performer, more than a headline. He became a symbol of fame's power, a symbol of fame's cost, and a reminder that sometimes the most fascinating mysteries are not hidden behind locked doors. They exist in plain sight, waiting for people to look beyond the stories they were told and see the human being underneath. The world spent years searching for Michael Jackson's secret life. But in the end, the real story may have been hiding in plain sight all along.